Hello, shall we begin? Thank you all for coming and joining us in the underbelly of the empire on such a wonderful Saturday. Summer on top, almost summer on top, but here we are conspiring against something, definitely against the empire. All right, it is such a pleasure to be facilitating this wonderful panel, and my job is the easiest here. I am the student here, and I'm going to learn from all of you. This panel will explore various forms of queer resistance to capitalism and imperialism over the past half-century in the US, Germany, and Iran. A special focus will be on queers who have been incarcerated, including those for their class, anti-racist struggle, activities, and those for survival crimes who then became prison organizers against inhumane conditions. I am Debarati Biswas, Debbie. I am the co-chair of CLAGS and assistant professor at City Tech CUNY. I will introduce the panelists in the order in which they will present. So first up is Soheil Asefi. He's a PhD candidate in history at the CUNY Graduate Center, as well as an exiled journalist and former political prisoner in Iran. His dissertation examines queer anti-imperialist solidarities using oral history, prison writings, destroyed artworks, and archival methods. Next up will be Emily Hobson, and Emily is an associate professor of history and gender, race, and identity at the University of Nevada, Reno. Hobson is the author of Lavender and Red, Liberation and Solidarity in the Gay and Lesbian Left, and co-editor of Remaking Radicalism, a grassroots documentary reader of the United States 1973 to 2001. And Bob Lederer is a longtime left queer, anti-racist, anti-imperialist, anti-patriarchal activist and journalist. He has written for many progressive, queer, and HIV publications. A producer since 1990 at WBAI's Pacifica Radio. He's part of the Out FM Left Queer / Trans Collective and the group Resistance in Brooklyn. He also has fellowships with CLAGS and Out History. Well, without further ado, I'm going to give it to Soheil to talk about your paper. Soheil.
This one, yeah. Presenter, use presenter, yeah. Sorry, thank you. And I go with this one. Yes. Thank you all for being here this Saturday, and thank you to Matt and to everyone at CLAGS for the labor of bringing us together in such an unsettled time. I want to begin by acknowledging that speaking about anything other than the current US-Israeli imperialist aggression against Iran is difficult for me. Over the past months, I've found myself constantly checking my phone. And I have not heard from part of my family for more than 2 months. So together with two fellow historians and activists, Emily and Bob, I would like to begin with the words of the fallen German communist Karl Liebknecht from his 1915 leaflet, Der Hauptfeind steht im eigenen Land. The main enemy is at home. Let me begin not with theory, but with a year. In much of queer historiography, the late 1970s are narrated as a period of consolidation, post-Stonewall visibility, community formation, what some historians have called the gay decade. If 1969 anchors that narrative, I want to ask what changes if we take 1979 as a global turning point, not only conceptually, but historically. In Iran, revolutionary courts and later prison tribunals recognize political life through forced renunciation and execution. In New York, the expansion of mass incarceration governs sexuality through surveillance, hierarchy, and violence. In West Berlin, exile produces archives, testimonies, and fragmented forms of memory in the absence of justice. Different ideologies, different institutions, but increasingly comparable administrative logic. In this talk, I use queerness not as an identity or a category of sexuality, but as a historical analytic. By queerness, I mean forms of life, relations of intimacy, loyalty, and political commitment that becomes legible, punishable, or unspeakable within these regimes. These are not metaphors, they are distinct regimes, judicial, carceral, and exilic, each reconstructing what it was possible to say, feel, and sustain. My argument is simple. After 1979, these regimes do not merely punish, they reorganize the political field. Queerness in this work names what persists at the limit of that recognition just before it disappears. Yeah, a little bit this one. Try this one? Yeah, the next. Yeah, this one. Yeah. Yep. The next one. Yeah, this one. میدانی که چقدر دوستت دارم. اولین خواهشم این است که مدتی پس از مرگم ازدواج کنی. من اکنون با 9 نفر دیگر شاد و خندان آوازخوان به سوی شهادت در راه آزادی می رویم. بدان که من خوشبختم. از نبودن من ناراحت نباش. من در راه رهایی زحمتکشان تلاش کردم و تا آخر به این راه وفادار ماندم. My dear Parveen, endless greetings to you. You know how deeply I love you. My first request is that sometime after my death, you remarry. I am now with 9 others, joyful, smiling, singing as we go toward martyrdom in the path of freedom. Know that I am content. Do not be saddened by my absence. I have struggled for the liberation of the oppressed, and I have remained faithful to this path until the end. This letter was written in the summer of 1988. Shahrukh Jahangiri, a school teacher, cab driver, and member of the Tudeh Communist Party of Iran, wrote it from inside the Islamic Republic's prison system, soon after he was executed. To understand this moment, we need to situate it institutionally. After the 1979 revolution, revolutionary court replaced ordinary judicial procedures. By 1988, following the Iran-Iraq War, special tribunals, later known as the death commissions, were established to process political prisoners already serving sentences. The procedure was stark. Brief sessions, often only minutes long, no formal charges, no legal representation, a handful of questions, a demand for renunciation. But notice the shift. The tribunal does not primarily ask, what did you do? It asks, what are you now? Do you renounce Marxism? Do you denounce your comrades? Will you cooperate? Political conventions becomes a categorical test. Belief is reduced to a bureaucratic decision. Yes or no, life or death. The letter you see here becomes a counter document, not evidence for the court, but testimony against the state's power to classify a life. My claim is not only that revolutions were defeated, it is that politics itself was translated into administrative language that could be felt, processed, and punished. We can see this translation in the archive, in the language of files. In New York sentencing reports, repeat offender replaces political and social context. In Iranian prison, records munafiq replaces political affiliation. And in West Berlin police dossier, security risk replaces migrant political identity. Across these sites, the political is reorganized under new bureaucratic categories: criminal offense, moral corruption, security threat. The shift is historically specific. In New York, intensified enforcement of the Rockefeller drug laws produces the figure of the career criminal. Street and survival economies are converted into durable felony status. In Tehran, revolutionary courts expand theological legal categories such as enemy of God and corrupter on earth. Dissent becomes not only illegal but existentially illegitimate. And in West Berlin, Cold War security frameworks extend from counterterrorism into the governance of migrants, radicals, and political exile. Different regimes, different ideologies, but increasingly comparable administrative solutions. Militancy becomes crime. Intimacy becomes corruption. Solidarity becomes threat. The prison then does not appear at the end of politics. It becomes a central mechanism for reorganizing politics itself. Let me stay in New York, but enter it through a queer archive that is also a prison archive. If we read the late 1970s only through the lens of coming out, we miss a crucial dimension of this history. The newspaper Gay Sunshine, founded in 1970s in California, developed a significant readership among incarcerated people by the mid to late 1970s. It circulated in prisons such as Attica, Soheil, and Rikers Island, moving across state lines through subscriptions and informal exchange networks. Prison authorities frequently confiscated the paper under regulations governing security and institutional safety. Notice that vocabulary. It is administrative, not moral. It belongs to the same bureaucratic register we have already seen in Tehran and will see again in West Berlin. I want to treat Gay Sunshine not simply as a gay newspaper, but as evidence of a prison-born queer public. The letters it published were often censored, edited, or excerpted. What circulated publicly was already shaped by institutional control. What emerged then is counter-public constituted with confinement itself. Here, queer critique does not emerge from visibility, from the pride or the bar, but from within the carceral apparatus. This is Eddie Rastellini. He wrote to Gay Sunshine from prison in the late 1970s. At the time, consensual sodomy remained criminalized in many US states, but prison governance operated according to its own logic, often insulted from shifts to civil law. Rastellini was held in protective custody, a bureaucratic category for prisons deemed vulnerable. In practice, it meant isolation. From that position, he makes a stark observation. The prisoners who assault gay intimates are more accepted than he is. This is not only an expression of personal suffering, it is a structural insight, one that aligns with prison administrative practices documented in disciplinary records, where protective custody functioned less as protection than as segregation. The prison does not simply contain violence, it organizes it. Dominance becomes legible, vulnerability becomes punishable. Queerness here is not treated as identity, but as a problem of management, something to be classified, separated, and controlled. Let me return briefly to Tehran. Inside Evin prison, interrogation became what historian Erwan Abrahamian has called a theater of confession, because on interviews with former prisoners and court records, based on interviews with former prisoners and court records collected in the 1990s, prisoners were required to recount Marxism, denounce comrades, and narrate their past as ideological error. This process was not primarily informational, it was administrative. The system did not seek to discover truth, it sought to produce a governable subject. The question, do you renounce Marxism, function as a bureaucratic test? It reorganized the boundary between the redeemable and the expendable. In US prisons, managed sexuality as a problem of order. Here we see belief itself converted into administrative eligibility. The 1988 executions were not an aberration. They marked the culmination of a decade-long process, a sustained pedagogy of forced repentance. New York and West Berlin is often remembered as a liberal island, even a queer refuge, but it was also a city structured by emergency governance. Until 1990, West Berlin remained under Allied occupation. It was heavily subsidized, densely policed, and governed through Cold War security infrastructure. By the 1980s, policing and security expenditures formed a central component of its administrative structure. This environment attracted draft resistors, autonomous queer collectives, and political exiles from the global south, including Iranian exile organizations, Turkish leftist groups, and queer autonomous networks documented in police and activist archives of the period. By the late 1980s, West Berlin had one of the largest Iranian exile communities in Europe, which brings me to this document, Bericht über 83 gefangene Frauen im Iran, 89, a dossier produced by exile networks in Berlin documenting 83 imprisoned Iranian women. It was compiled through interviews, letters smuggled out of prison, and transnational activist networks linking Tehran to West Berlin. What does this document do? It counter-classified against the Islamic Republic's categories, enemy of God, corrupt on earth. It insists on names, affiliations, and political histories. Naming here becomes a form of counter-sovereignty, a refusal of disappearance. I want to end not with a grave, but a room. In a Berlin apartment in 2020, Farzaneh, a former member of the Marxist-Leninist Peykar organization, spoke to me about life after revolution and exile. In prison and in exile, she entered a marriage structured not by romance, but by necessity, protection, trust, survival. Years later, after that marriage ended, she formed a relationship with a woman neighbor. When I asked how she would describe herself, she said, خودمو هیچی اسم نمیذارم. عاشق یه زنی شدم همچنان عاشقشم. همین. I don't call myself anything. I love the woman. I still love her. That's enough. I want to take that sentence seriously as a historical method, not as identity, but as evidence of how intimacy persists after the collapse of political wars. It refuses the Islamic Republic's categories, but it also refuses our analytical impulse to stabilize experience into identity. Here, intimacy is not identity formation, it is survival beyond classification. Human rights frameworks have been indispensable. They have provided documentation, asylum claims, legal recognition, and often literal survival. But they also translate political meaning. As Samuel Moyn has argued, the rise of human rights in the 1970s coincided with the decline of earlier revolutionary and redistributive political projects, offering instead a moral language centered on suffering. We can see this shift in practice. In reports by organizations such as Amnesty International in the 1980s, Marxist militants often appear primarily as prisoners of conscience. Revolutionaries are recast as victims. These categories make claim legible within international law. They enable advocacy, recognition, and protection, but they can also detach memory from militancy. What disappears is not suffering, it is the political horizon in which the suffering was produced. So let's go to my last, since we don't have time. Let me close by returning to a structure, from queer prison letters moving through confiscation to tribunals in Tehran converting belief into a yes or no test, to Dussiert in Berlin insisting on names, to Farzane's quiet refusal of categories. These are not separate archives. They are fragments of the same historical transformation. What we see across these sites is not simply the expansion of prisons, but a broader synchronization of carceral governance, theocratic regimes, liberal democracies, and capitalist state, despite their ideological differences. Rich for strikingly similar administrative tools, special courts, isolation regimes, mandatory sentencing, and the bureaucratic language of security. If that is the case, then two implications follow. First, abolition cannot remain nationally framed. Second, queer politics cannot be reduced to visibility as liberation. So I want to end not with conclusion, but with three questions. Questions I hope we can think about together. What might abolition mean beyond the nation state, especially if the carceral strategy we confront have been historically coordinated across borders? What does historical memory owe to defeated political futures? And finally, what might queer refusal look like when the demand placed on our lives is always translation into crime, into corruption, into threat, or into victim? That's it.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It's good to see you. I'm so happy to be here, and I want to thank Bob and Soheil for organizing me into this panel, and Debbie for shepherding us. And thank all of you for stepping away from the excitement of connecting with people in the main space to hear our papers. I'm speaking today from a book manuscript that I'm writing on the history of AIDS prison activism in the United States. It's a wide-ranging history, one that some people here have been part of, both as prisoner solidarity activists and as incarcerated activists. And I'm deeply grateful to those of you who've been part of this history. In particular, I want to shout out a handsome guy in the white shirt with the hat, Brian Carmichael, for being here. It's really wonderful to have you here. Brian is somebody I've been able to interview for this project, and you'll see him featured an even more handsome, younger photo on the screen. Like the HIV and AIDS epidemic itself, the history that I'm tracing of AIDS prison activism encompasses both LGBTQ and straight people, right? The epidemic is no real observer of identity. And my book project examines the AIDS prison movement through queer and abolitionist perspectives, but really doesn't concentrate on identity per se, right? So kind of in some ways, like Soheil, have used queer more as a framework of political analysis than an identity. But today for this conference, I really did want to kind of turn to highlight one of the most clearly gay-identified stories in this history, in the hopes of analyzing the class and racial relationships that emerged through specifically gay AIDS activism in prison. So to kind of situate us in place, across the 1980s and 1990s, the California Medical Facility, or CMF, which is a men's prison also known as Vacaville, housed California's largest AIDS prison ward. Vacaville had for decades incarcerated many gay and trans people who were placed there on psychiatric designations as the result of their sexuality or gender expression and been subjected to psychiatric abuse, especially in the 1960s and 70s. By the 1980s, some of the worst of those practices had largely ended, but carceral control of sexuality continued, as Soheil has talked about, as a classification and a security designation. It also found a new focus, which was HIV status. The state of California responded to incarcerated people with HIV and AIDS through segregation. It assigned them to closed housing units in a couple specific prisons. It excluded them from main recreation yards, visiting areas, and libraries, as well as from jobs in the prison, educational programs, and generally the chance to earn good time off their sentences. AIDS segregation was applied to both women's and men's prisons and across sexuality. And at the same time, California prisons kept HIV testing voluntary, which was a policy that met civil liberties demands around testing, but it also really entrenched the prison's power, because segregation also disincentivized HIV testing, right? You didn't want to turn up positive and then be stuck in the unit. And that in turn allowed prisons to keep a lid on their healthcare costs. Although there was a 1988 study that revealed that thousands more prisoners were HIV positive than were actually being housed in the HIV/AIDS units, the state kept its policies and really hastened the deaths of people with AIDS while furthering HIV stigma and transmission among people outside the units. So AIDS activists in Vacaville were really part of a national movement, but they stood out in a notable way in being largely gay men and kind of prominently white gay men who were moved to act by the deaths of other gay men and trans women in the prison, who prominently included Black and Latinx people abandoned by prison medical neglect. Elsewhere in the United States, especially on the East Coast, AIDS organizing in prisons was more visibly in the 80s and 90s led by people who identified as straight and as former users of injection drugs, often as Black and Latinx also. So really kind of outside of California, when queerness was named in AIDS prison activism, it was most typically actually in women's prisons and not men's. But AIDS work in Vacaville really broke those patterns. And it attracted some kind of different attention from the broader AIDS and gay movements for that reason. The gayness of AIDS activism at Vacaville grew in large part from the prison's history that I've talked about of gay and trans incarceration and HIV/AIDS segregation. There were also some factors shaping the AIDS epidemic in California that left it more prominently centered among gay and bisexual men and less among people who inject drugs than on the East Coast, and that showed up both inside and outside of prisons. And then finally, the geography and racial dynamics of gay community mattered as well to the organizing. As you can see from the map, Vacaville is located basically between San Francisco and Sacramento on Interstate 80, less than an hour's drive from San Francisco. That placed it nearby a really highly organized gay community that was ideologically diverse, but privileged to have made some inroads into establishment politics. And activists inside Vacaville made use of really any and all connections to the outside that they could, including through the gay press, through the queer radicalism of ACT UP, and through liberal networks of gay rights in the Democratic Party. By the late 1980s, people incarcerated in Vacaville, both people who were HIV positive and not, were organizing. In this slide oh shoot, I have a typo. That's Law Wilson, not Wilson. Didn't notice that last night. But the slide kind of profiles three of those people, although I'll name a number more. Of people who were organizing, two of them, Laus Schumann and Michael Haggerty, who were Latino and white respectively, and both of them gay, worked with the prison's Catholic chaplain to develop a pastoral care program for people who were dying of AIDS. By 1991, over 24 incarcerated people were involved in that program as volunteers. They were granted a badge that allowed them to enter the AIDS unit and hospital wing without a strip search, so most of those volunteers were actually housed outside the AIDS unit. And then once there, they provided informal counseling. They helped people who were sick and bedridden to do things like eat. They changed people's sheets or diapers, and they sat with those who were dying. So pastoral care was a deeply politicizing experience. Brian Carmichael was a Vacaville pastoral care worker. He continues to work as a community health advocate today. And he's recalled that one of the first people he sat with while dying was a Muslim man named Ishmael. Carmichael visited the prison's imam to borrow a copy of the Quran to read to Ishmael, and that was an act that inspired some other Muslim prisoners to become pastoral care workers themselves. Then when Carmichael spoke to the prison's doctor about his grief over Ishmael's death, that doctor, who was himself Afro-Boricua and gay, lent him copies of Larry Kramer's The Normal Heart and Randy Schultz's book And the Band Played On. And reading those works showed Carmichael, he said showed him that we're not alone, that there are other people fighting back. That was the final ingredient that turned me into a militant homosexual, like a hardcore activist. Still, conditions in Vacaville kept getting worse. Incarcerated people began to organize in other ways. Some held jobs as clerks, which was a classed and possibly racialized privilege because it relied on a level of education and trust from prison staff. And Carmichael also remembers that in his recollection, a lot of clerks were gay. The clerks took notes on administrative documents. They shared information secretly with their peers. Some people who were becoming activists also wrote to people who were political on the outside and to journalists. They got attention from local radio and newspapers. And they also worked to bring the AIDS quilt to Vacaville. In February 1992, this succeeded when staff of the AIDS quilt brought 22 panels inside the prison for display. And Vacaville activists also added quilt panels they'd made. The largest one they made shown here on the right, showed 4 men, black, white, Latinx, and indigenous, dressed in prison uniforms and standing behind bars but in front of a giant rainbow. There was a homophobic associate warden who accepted the design because she didn't know rainbows had become a gay symbol. On another quilt panel that I honestly just found today, thanks to Brian, Brian told me about it, somebody else found it. This was a collection of signature panels, also made in 1992, but kind of held back for some time from being sent into the AIDS quilt, really as a form of censorship. It included a quote from the Quran about stupid people that was written in Arabic under the associate warden's signature, and also a message from Carmichael that inscribed the goal of extending the pastoral care program into a care facility. He wrote, "All I want for Christmas is a hospice at CMF." And as you can see from the photograph, the quilts were displayed in the prison chapel. People circulated throughout the chapel for hours to view them, and the display won media coverage that kind of featured the solidarity and even the kind of bonds of affection among people who had made the quilts. The AIDS unit by now held over 350 people who began to be held to a cell, which increased stress and the risk of opportunistic infections. And a number of things started to get even worse. There were 3 competent prison doctors. That's often an oxymoron. It wasn't in this case. 3 doctors who resigned to protest administrative obstacles to care. The Catholic chaplain also had to go on medical leave, which left the pastoral care workers vulnerable. And the prison got a more repressive warden. So prison administrators began to block pastoral care. They conducted harassing searches of activist cells, and people with AIDS started to find it harder to get the extra food and vitamins and nutritional shakes that they'd been relying on to maintain a healthy weight. So the activists inside Vacaville met secretly in the chapel. They assigned themselves roles. They designated Brian as press spokesperson and Laos Schumann as lead contact with the administration, just to go back to those folks. Another key individual inside was Law Wilson, who was a gay man with AIDS who had previously worked in San Francisco and been quite prominent in gay rights advocacy and through the San Francisco Democratic Party. He had also worked as a lawyer for the San Francisco Police Department. So it was a major scandal, as you can imagine, when he was convicted on drug charges. Once he was sentenced, he was sent to Vacaville because of his AIDS status. And as conditions in the prison worsened, he used his connections to reach out for help to a powerful state legislator for the Bay Area named John Burton. Then in September 92, 5 people with AIDS died at Vacaville in just 2 weeks. And the deaths of 2 sparked particular outrage. One of them, Tasha Teague, was a black trans woman who collapsed in the AIDS unit. People around her called for help. A medical team arrived, but the head nurse refused to enter the unit out of fear of AIDS, which led to a long delay that compromised any chance to save her life. The other person was David Rosario, a Latino man. He was placed in solitary confinement despite having vomited blood, and he was found dead the next morning. The day after Rosario's death, people in the AIDS unit launched a medication boycott. Hundreds participated the first day, over 100 after 10 days. They won a meeting with prison administrators, but none of their demands, and so those insider connections that had started to be developed became even more crucial. Law Wilson had by now been released from prison. He joined ACT UP San Francisco and continued to communicate with Assemblymember Burton, who then sent lawyers to the prison to launch an investigation. Meanwhile, another man in the AIDS unit, Rico Rodriguez, died after calling out for help all night. People in nearby cells had seen a guard walk past him but ignore him. Rodriguez was found dead in his cell the next morning, naked and on the toilet, likely because he'd sought to cool himself down, cool down a fever with water from the sink. Carmichael and Schumann heard the news of his death at breakfast and immediately went to the unit where they collected 24 witness statements to send to Burton's office, media, and ACT UP. Carmichael was told that as staff carried out Rodriguez's body, one guard laughed, "That's one F word who shot his last wad." So this was a breaking point. And with little to lose, activists escalated to a hunger strike. Carmichael, who was negative, and Charles Perry, who was a person with AIDS, announced to journalists that they would refuse food until the prison met their demands, which were an outside investigation into the deaths, qualified medical staff, a compassionate release policy for people with AIDS, a meeting with the director of the State Department of Corrections, and a prison hospice. These demands were strategic because from behind the scenes, they knew that Burton's investigation had already begun, that the hiring of medical staff was under discussion, and that there was some legislative movement towards compassionate release. ACT UP threw support behind the strike. It held a vigil, and it generated pressure through phone and fax apps of officials. After a week of the strike continuing, the prison announced that it would begin to force feed anyone who refused to eat for 10 or more days. And in addition to being torture, this would have ended the hunger strikers' access to media by placing them in hospital care. So 10 people in the AIDS unit joined the strike to turn it into a rolling action. Carmichael and Perry began to accept food, but others took their place by fasting for 5 days, and then they passed the role on to others to continue the strike as a relay. 3 weeks into the hunger strike, Assemblymember Burton's team issued their report. Although they failed to name the staff responsible for recent deaths, they documented extensive abuse and neglect and called for changes that aligned with activist demands. So the demand of an outside investigation was now won, and days later, 2 more demands were met as the State Director of Corrections met with the strikers and agreed to the prison hospice. Activists called off the strike and claimed victory. And as you can see just from these clippings, the hunger strike, protests to support it, and Burton's response all won significant coverage in media, in mainstream newspapers and also especially in Bay Area gay newspapers, highlighting its activist leaders. In February 1993, Vacaville opened the first hospice in a state prison in the country. In the coming weeks and years, pastoral care volunteers sat with people who were dying in shifts around the clock to fulfill their motto that no one should die alone. For activists, this was an important step to claim a sense of agency against the institutional violence and neglect of prison. Carmichael called the hospice the brightest spot in the prison, telling the Bay Area Reporter, I suspect the California Department of Corrections is more interested in the symbolism rather than the substance, but the PCS volunteers will ensure the spirit is there. Indeed, the victory was complicated. State retaliation rolled on, the leaders faced solitary confinement, beatings, punitive transfers to higher level security prisons, and barriers to compassionate release. California, of course, also kept building prisons, and the prison hospice in many ways sustained rather than undid carceral power. But the organizing inside and across prison walls that the Vacaville activists began set into motion relationships that really proved long-standing. The fight against Vacaville significantly amplified attention to issues of incarceration in the Bay Area gay press, and by the end of the decade, as I'm tracing in the broader book project, it really helped to shape the 1998 Critical Resistance Conference, which was a major turning point that helped to generate what we now know as the prison abolition movement. The fight at Vacaville also upended typical binaries and divides in queer politics, such as those between white gay men and queer and trans people of color, and between gay rights and queer radicalism. Perhaps the convergence of AIDS and incarceration, which is so clearly, I think, a site of queer class relations, became a generative site of queer class politics. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming, and I want to thank CLAGS for the time for this panel, and my colleagues today for assembling this panel, and particularly Soheil at this difficult, painful time for you and your family as your country is under attack from the U.S. and Israel. So I'll be speaking on queer U.S. political prisoners, from Black Panthers to indigenous militants to Puerto Rican independentistas to war crimes whistleblowers to forest protectors and more. So let me begin with the quote from a South African anti-apartheid fighter. "I am Black and I am gay. I cannot separate the two parts of me into secondary and primary struggles. In South Africa, I am oppressed as a Black person, and I am oppressed because I am gay. So when I fight for my freedom, I must fight against both oppressions, all intolerance, all injustice." That statement was by Simon Nkosi, the late lifelong anti-apartheid militant, gay liberationist, and later AIDS activist. From 1985 to 1988, he was one of the Delmas 22 anti-apartheid activists facing execution by the racist regime for high treason, terrorism, and furthering the aims of the African National Congress. After a worldwide pressure campaign, they were all eventually released. Simon went on to be a major national leader in the lesbian and gay movement and a key organizer behind South Africa becoming, in 1995, the first country on earth to enshrine lesbian and gay rights in the national constitution. Simon Nkosi inspired progressive queer activists, especially Black ones worldwide, who spread the word about his accomplishments. Sadly, he died of AIDS in 1998. I begin with this story because I think Simon Nkoli's life is symbolic of the journeys made by many U.S. queer and trans anti-racist freedom fighters of diverse backgrounds. They share an understanding that, as Marsha P. Johnson said, no pride for some of us without liberation for all of us. In other words, the most liberatory struggle interlinks and extends solidarity to all oppressed peoples, unlike today's single-issue queer rights movement dominant in the global north. My investigation in progress to become later on a book and a multimedia website, examines the over 160 lesbian, gay, bi, trans, non-binary, two-spirit, and gender non-conforming leftists who I've identified that faced harassment and often incarceration for their radical, class-conscious, anti-racist politics from the late 1960s until now. I found queer and trans fighters playing an important role, and punished for it, in every major U.S. social justice movement of the past 6 decades. At the same time, their queerness is too often little known. I come to this project partly based on my own experience, choosing months of prison time rather than comply with an order to become a federal grand jury snitch against my anti-imperialist comrades. Thank you. It's what anyone should do faced with that dilemma. My research has included oral histories, recordings, memoirs, historical accounts, web searches, and primary source material from archives. I stand on the shoulders of other queer historians, especially Bettina Aptheker, Sarah Schulman, Miriam Frank, Mary Frances Phillips, and my 2 co-panelists, Soheil Asefi, himself a former political prisoner, and Emily Hobson, whose work and feedback have been invaluable, and I thank you all for your work. So the common threads among all these cases are the following characteristics which reflect broader patterns of political repression against queer, trans, straight, and cis folks alike. First, social justice activists with a radical viewpoint and political practice are often subjected to harsher attacks and longer sentences than those charged with similar non-political crimes. Second, these persecutions and prosecutions have often been guided or directed by the U.S. Secret Police, the FBI. This has included targeted attacks on actual, perceived, or even falsely labeled queer and trans activists. The FBI's notorious counterintelligence program, or COINTELPRO, targeted every major 60s social justice movement, including gay liberation, but its special ferocity focused on the Black Panther Party, with character assassination, false rumors, the imprisonment of hundreds of organizers, and the killing of at least 29. It was ostensibly shut down after exposed by a 1971 activist raid, which incidentally included a lesbian, on an FBI local office in Pennsylvania, but actually has continued under other names until today. Third, many victories have been won against these repressive tactics by long-term, strategically designed mass campaigns that exposed and resisted the inhumanity and deep injustices of these cases. Often these campaigns have been led or joined by queers alongside others. In several cases I'll highlight, popular struggle freed people, but years later they faced new legal attacks and were re-incarcerated. Today I'll share only a few brief case studies of these sheroes, heroes, and theyros to demonstrate the courage and ingenuity, but also the hardships and pain suffered by these queer and trans freedom fighters. I've been privileged to interview several of these folks or their representatives on the collective weekly Queer Trans Left radio live stream program I'm part of, outfm.org. So, Erica Huggins is an out queer Black Panther activist who in 1969 faced the FBI-directed murder of her husband and their best friend, both leading Panthers in LA, and that was John Huggins and Bunchy Carter, which was a shocking and traumatic experience for her and her family, which included an infant at that time. That was followed by frame-up charges against her and 8 other Panthers and supporters in New Haven, Connecticut. After a long national movement mobilization, she and her co-defendants were acquitted, a huge defeat for the feds, but not until after she spent 2 years in pretrial detention. While there, she co-founded a mutual aid group that helped incarcerated women navigate the misogynist and repressive prison conditions. After her acquittal, she directed a Panther-led primary school in Oakland, California for 8 years, and later worked with HIV/AIDS care organizations. Erica Huggins, now 78, is a published poet and co-authored the excellent photo book Comrade Sisters, Women of the Black Panther Party, which notes that 60% of Panther members were women. She urges everyone to read party leader Huey Newton's groundbreaking public letter supporting the women's and gay liberation movements, issued just a year after Stonewall and available at outfm.org. The late Eddie Hatcher was a gay Tuscarora indigenous activist who, with a colleague, gained national publicity for an armed takeover of a North Carolina newspaper office in 1988. They demanded state action to stop local police murders and police involvement in the drug trade in this very poor, majority black and indigenous rural area. Eddie Hatcher was first acquitted by an all-black federal jury, but then retried by the state and sentenced to 18 years. But after his public announcement that he was gay and had AIDS, a national campaign of indigenous and other activists supported by Amnesty International, church leaders, and several congresspeople won his release 7 years into his sentence. Yet just 6 years later, he was framed for a murder that no evidence tied him to. He faced execution, was sentenced to life in prison, and died of AIDS in 2009 at age 51 after years of inadequate prison medical care. Ricardo Jimenez is a gay man from the U.S. colony of Puerto Rico who was one of a dozen independentista fighters convicted of seditious conspiracy for membership in the U.S.-based Armed Forces of National Liberation. Sentenced to 98 years, he served 19 years in U.S. prisons, all in maximum security, until granted clemency and released by President Clinton in 1999, along with 11 other political prisoners, following a years-long international support campaign that I was privileged to be part of, with many others. After his release, Ricardo came out as gay and now lives in Chicago, where he directs the Puerto Rican HIV/AIDS support agency Vidacida, which especially aims to serve Latinx, queer, and trans folks. Chelsea Manning is, of course, a world-renowned Army intelligence analyst who in 2010 released a huge trove of government documents and videos through WikiLeaks showing shocking U.S. human rights abuses in Iraq and elsewhere. Her revelations gained front-page coverage worldwide and further undercut U.S. public support for the Iraq occupation. She spent 7 years of a 35-year sentence in a military brig until winning presidential clemency in 2017. From 2019 to 2020, she served another 10 months in prison for refusing to provide testimony to a grand jury investigating WikiLeaks. Leading UN human rights officials labeled both incarcerations as torture. When originally incarcerated, Manning identified as a gay man and then transitioned as a trans woman. She fought tenaciously for gender-affirming and trans-positive care in the military and civilian prisons that held her. Since her release, she has maintained her social justice commitment, including arrests in 2 recent civil disobedience actions, one protesting the trans bathroom ban at the U.S. Capitol building, and the other last week in the giant pro-Palestine direct action in New York demanding that congressional Democrats stop funding military aid for Israeli genocide. And a quick note, yesterday outside this building, queers were among the CUNY faculty and staff for Justice in Palestine who vigiled on the internationally recognized Palestinian Prisoners' Day to demand that Israeli occupation forces release thousands of political prisoners and repeal the new racist death penalty law aimed only at Palestinians. So I urge everyone here, as the Palestinians have reminded us, to never stop speaking about Palestine. Now I want to discuss a current case, the queer and trans activists being prosecuted along with many straight and cis folks for participating in a multiracial black-led movement that has since 2022 protested to block the construction of an 85-acre, $90 million police militarization facility near Atlanta for training in urban warfare. The push to build it accelerated in 2020 after the nationwide protests against police violence. The Stop Cop City movement, as they call themselves, also call themselves forest protectors, since the construction is destroying wildlife in one of Georgia's largest green spaces. The movement engaged in street protests, petitioning, tree sitting, and sabotaging construction equipment. Unfortunately, their efforts were defeated, and this facility is now under construction. But before that happened, many activists were indicted on various charges, including so-called domestic terrorism. And one, who you see here, was murdered by the state. Manuel Esteban Paez Terán, who went by Tortuguita and they-them pronouns, was a queer, non-binary, indigenous Venezuelan. In 2023, Georgia police assassinated them with 57 shots as they peacefully occupied the forests, which sparked nationwide protests. An independent autopsy showed they were shot with their hands in the air, and their parents have sued the police for wrongful death. Tortuguita's courage inspires thousands today. A report on Stop Cop City in Mainline, an Atlanta-based prison abolitionist magazine, said, quote, "Queer and trans youth have played a significant role and have also been distinctly vulnerable to violent policing and incarceration," unquote. One of these is Charlie Tenenbaum, a non-binary activist charged with felony intimidation and held for 2 months in 2023 for distributing flyers in the neighborhood of an officer involved in Tortuguita's murder. Another defendant is Vienna Forrest, a trans woman held in 2022 for days in solitary confinement and later included in the state's sweeping indictment of 61 protesters charged with racketeering and conspiracy, known as RICO, facing up to 20 years in prison for their roles in the movement. The UN standards for imprisoned people, aka the Mandela rules, prohibit solitary confinement for 15 or more days, calling the punishment, quote, "cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment," unquote. Before being freed on bail, Forrest felt like the movement was over, but Tortuguita, her then partner, before he was murdered, gave her some hope when Forrest called them from jail. Luckily, last year, a Georgia court dismissed the RICO charges against all the defendants. However, the state attorney general is appealing, and 5 protesters still face other felony charges. Trans activist and attorney Dean Spade has written, quote, "The indictment paints the organizing done by many different people using different tactics with different ideologies, but all opposed to this terrible expansion of police infrastructure as a criminal conspiracy, and makes getting the word out, supporting criminalized protesters, organizing events, sharing food, and doing direct action, all part of that conspiracy," unquote. The group Interrupting Criminalization has written, quote, "The people accused in it are already facing vigilante violence and threats, raising serious concerns for their safety. In some cases, their bank accounts have been frozen or closed, they've lost jobs and been denied educational opportunities, and they are having trouble finding housing, all because of draconian, politically motivated charges against them based on unproven allegations." Transgender attorney Lyra Foster, who's representing queer identifying Stop Cop City activists, said last year that visibly gender expansive defendants experience, quote, "the vast difference in punishment and suffering that's inflicted on other defendants who've been arrested for the same thing." Trans non-binary artist and Stop Cop City defendant Noel Grigney told Mainline, quote, "Queer people in the movement are aware that the police state wants to eradicate us. That puts us in a position where we have less to lose. We've already come to terms with what is difficult for most people to realize, that these systems must be abolished." I'd like to end on a positive note. Marius Mason is a white trans anarchist man given a harsh federal prison sentence in 2009 for militant action in support of environmental and animal rights. Since transitioning in federal prison, he has fought tenaciously for trans rights for himself and others. Last year, due to Trump's anti-trans onslaught, he was moved back to a women's prison against his will. But luckily, he will be released next month after 17 long years in prison. In a recent public letter, Marius Mason wrote, quote, "I really want you all to know how incredibly proud it made me to be part of a community of resistance that stood together. It demonstrated that in our movement, though we were physically separated, we could stay together in spirit, that solidarity and love are action words, and that we are all in it for the long haul," unquote. A fitting reminder, indeed, of the never-ending importance of supporting queer and trans political prisoners, and indeed all types of political prisoners, particularly in this time of extreme heightened repression, the ICE murder of lesbian Renee Good being just one recent example, with more soon to come. The price of going up against the state to fight for justice can be alarmingly high, but our many queer and trans forebears and current comrades teach us that this is a painful but crucial step on the path to our own liberation. Thank you.
Thank you all for such thought-provoking and, in this moment, this ruinous now, forever wars, genocidal times, Palestine, Sudan, Iran, DR, I'm thinking of Congo, so many places, people displaced, and the carceral, the prison is everywhere, right? That is one of the things that your talks, as I was listening, that's what I was thinking. So I was wondering if you all would like to ask each other a question, or should we open up? What's better? Open up? Okay. Yeah, so there are mics on both sides. If you have a question, if you can go up to the mic, I can also come to you with the mic if one prefer to sit and ask.
I don't know if I need a mic. I'm pretty loud. For the recording.
It's for the recording.
Well, no, just thank you all for your work. You said you were from BAI, or you work at BAI? Yes. Pacifica Radio Network includes, I think, KQED in San Francisco, and a couple other stations, but Pacifica Radio Network was the first one to put a story out. They sent a reporter, Wendell Harper, to the prison to interview us, and from there, we were able to say, well, they did this, and then get newspapers in, but it all started with Pacifica, so thank you for that. Yes. And that's it. You all are great. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all your terrific work over the years, and for that acknowledgement of Pacifica, which indeed is a precious gem for the U.S. left that we must make sure it survives and fends off the inevitable attacks that are coming from the Trump administration.
While you all develop your brilliant questions, first of all, I just want to give another shout out to Brian. It's a real gift to be able to be in conversation with him about this history. As you can tell, he has a memory like a steel trap for so many details, which is itself a gift. I had a question for you, Soheil. You're developing this framework to think so broadly and comparatively, which is really challenging. And I was noting down these three frameworks you're using to think about the US, Iran, and Germany, about criminal offense, moral corruption, security threat. And I'm wondering if you see those as echoes of each other or as interwoven and indirect conversation. Like, are you looking at how the states themselves are in conversation, or how do you see those connected?
Thank you, great question. Yeah, these are, as I mentioned, there are different regimes of incarceration, different regimes of, it's like especially in the post-1979 moment, which is at the center of my dissertation, is 1979 moment as the moment of revolution and counter-revolution. Yeah, but I'm looking for the pattern, how this pattern develops, and how we can put them into conversation in a transnational history. So the question is not here identity. The question is how this, how the analytical word of queerness, how analytical method of queerness can help us to situate each of them and put them into a meaningful conversation, despite different regimes and despite, I'm not saying that Iran was exactly like United States or United States was West Germany, with all their different contexts, the regimes, how they can actually help us to see the pattern and how this pattern developed actually.
Are there any more questions from the audience?
I'm going to ask a question. Can I ask a question? Yes. Hi. So first off, I just want to say thank you so much for this incredibly terrific panel. And thank you to all of you for your continuous both historical research and movement work. And thanks also to so many people in the audience who do that too. Among the many wonderful papers I've seen here, there have been some, but not a huge number, that are historical. And the histories that all of you are telling are so crucially important. And I know that some of you have worked as journalists, others have published in different movement contexts, as well as more traditional academic places. And I just want to hear any of you talk a little bit about where you see opportunity for circulating these really important histories of the queer left. There are precedents for the kind of struggles that we need to fight ahead, and preserving these and circulating these histories seem incredibly important. So I just want to ask that and say thank you.
Well, thank you, Christine, for that question, and your work has been really pivotal as well. I guess it's the contradictory nature of this era of late capitalism that, with the proliferation of corporate-controlled social media and other, web platforms, there are more opportunities than ever before to get the word out about progressive and left politics. So it's subject to a lot of censorship, but nonetheless, there are channels that still remain open, and of course, there are progressive radio stations like the Pacifica stations. So it's really a matter of being creative and persistent in seeking out those channels, and they're out there, and they're easily findable, and I think all three of us and many of our colleagues have worked those channels and worked social media with all of its limitations to reach bigger audiences than we've probably ever reached before. So I'm sure the two of you can add.
I think it's a great question, and I've definitely been thinking about this as I've been kind of looking forward to finishing up this book and being able to kind of use it in the world. One idea that I was talking with folks on the panel about before, and I've talked with Brian about, is there are really quite a number of those contributions to the AIDS quilt made in prison. So I have been dreaming for a while of an exhibit. There's over 200 such quilts, and I think that whenever I talk about them, people are very interested in them, and they also, I think, kind of have an effect of pulling interest among people who are not necessarily already deeply politicized, which is always so important, right? And kind of also because of the ways that they could potentially draw audiences, I think they're a great an exhibit like that in my mind would be a great opportunity to, bring speakers from organizations, have like action steps that people can take. Another way that I've been trying to bring my own work to broader audiences is publishing a couple pieces in The Abolitionist, which is the newspaper of critical resistance that circulates inside prisons as well as out, to kind of share some of these past stories. I was also part of a really great timeline exercise in a kind of retreat of people working in abolitionist campaigns, and it's been getting me to think about, how is it that some of these movement histories can really have meaning now, some of the lessons of what people did, just the very concrete things that people did to organize in conditions of really intense constraint, right? Because those conditions of constraint are getting worse, right? Problems of censorship, of what can get sent inside, how people can access information are really increasing because of the ways digital surveillance allows information to be repressed and communication to be repressed. Those are really significant problems that undercut some of the solidarity that I've seen in the past, right? Things like journalists being able to show up when incarcerated people call a press conference is not happening now. In some ways, the history is sort of showing problems getting worse, I think is really important, as well as the sort of history showing really creative forms of action. It offers some examples for people.
Just very short, just along with what Bob and Emily said. I mean, when we travel to the periphery of the system, what I was talking about, the question of visibility and stuff, we are living in a time of communicative capitalism. Aside from surveillance, aside from Trumpism, whatever, we are living in a time that there is a circulation of content. So if the circulation of content can we get any kind of act of solidarity from this circulation? I'm always talking about Fifth Avenue's radicalism here. So we are like, that's our everyday living and writing and teaching here. So how we can, these are about history, I would say, if we really want to go beyond the postmodern left, if we want to go back to to learn what happened in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So there is a historical continuity here and rupture, as historians use these buzzwords. So, I would say we have to go back there and to see what were these moments of queerness, the question of intimacy, the question of collective in its broader context, and the question of care in its broader context. How we can learn from that, and then as an act of public history, how we can talk with the audience and how we can make a community out of the archive, out of this very precarious life of many of us, how we can go to the question of collective. These are like a big, we can talk hours and hours about that, but that's my answer.
For the purposes of time, we will have to end here, but thank you all for for these wonderful provocations and so much to sit with. Where is it more structured by uncare than prison, right? And that is where we learn what radical care looks like and feels like, and, the intimacy of it. And may we all, bring it out into the open world where there is just no care. The prison is everywhere. We need care for each other, radical solidarities. Thank you all for being here, and